I'm looking out the window of a cramped 500-square-foot apartment in Columbus, Ohio. The radiator in the corner clanks every 20 minutes, and it's freezing outside. If you had told me 3 years ago that this is where I would end up, checking my bank app just to make sure I have enough to cover groceries this week, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I had a liquid portfolio of nearly $1 million, a fully paid-off home, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that my final years were financially bulletproof. Today I'm 72 years old, deeply estranged from my own children, and surviving strictly on Social Security and a small pension, $400,000. That is exactly what it cost me. It wasn't lost in a sudden market crash. It wasn't drained by unexpected medical bills. I wired it away, willingly, across international borders, straight into a phantom LLC and untraceable offshore accounts. I was never a foolish man. I spent 40 years as a civil engineer, managing massive infrastructure projects. My entire professional existence was built on mathematics, risk assessment, and seeing the tiny invisible fractures in a foundation before the concrete was even poured. I was the guy with the spreadsheet, the pragmatist, the smartest guy in the room who never ever made a move without a contingency plan. I'm not recording this to ask for your pity. I don't deserve a single drop of it. And I am certainly not here to curse the woman who stripped my life bare and vanished while I was out of town visiting my grandson. She simply saw a target, drew up a blueprint, and executed it flawlessly. No, the person who conned me the hardest was me. I'm making this because you need to understand how a man who built his entire life on cold, hard logic could look at a dozen glaring neon warning signs and still choose to willingly step off a cliff. Because looking back, the collapse was always inevitable. But I've learned the hard way that when you are quietly starving for something you refuse to admit you need, you will look right at a catastrophic structural failure and convince yourself it's just the wind. For 42 years, my life was measured in tensile strength, load-bearing capacities, and stress thresholds. I was a civil engineer. I didn't just build things. I anticipated exactly how and why they might fall apart. You don't get to direct a $60 million highway overpass project if you make decisions based on gut feelings or wishful thinking. Every choice I ever made was backed by rigorous mathematics and risk assessment. If a contractor tried to cut corners on a concrete pour, I spotted it. If a structural beam had a millimeter of deflection that shouldn't be there, I flagged it. My entire brain was wired to detect structural vulnerabilities long before the collapse. I applied that exact same rigid architecture to my personal life. I was never a gambler, never a man who chased get-rich-quick schemes. I tracked every dollar that came in, and every dollar that went out on a master spreadsheet I updated religiously every Sunday morning. By the time I sold my stake in the engineering firm and stepped into retirement, I had an $850,000 liquid portfolio, a 4-bedroom house with the deed sitting in a fireproof safe, and a pension that guaranteed I'd never have to rely on anyone. I was the absolute provider. My wife of 40 years never had to lose a night of sleep worrying about a bill. My 2 kids went to good colleges and graduated without a dime of debt. I was the rock. I was the smart guy who planned for every conceivable contingency. I had built an impenetrable fortress for my family. But the thing about building a fortress is that it gets awfully cold and echoing once you're the only one left inside it. 3 years ago, my wife passed away. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, And after my kids went back to their own busy lives in other states, the silence in that big Ohio house became physical. It had a weight to it. I would wake up at 6 a.m. out of pure decades-old habit, brew a pot of coffee, sit at the kitchen island, and realize I had absolutely nothing to do. No crews to manage, no complex logistical problems to solve, and worst of all, no one who actively needed me. People think the hardest part of aging is the physical decline. It's really not. My joints ached when it rained, sure, but I was healthy, I was sharp. The hardest part is the sudden crushing irrelevance. I would go to the hardware store or the bank, and people would just look right through me. I wasn't Richard Vance, the formidable senior project manager, anymore. To the rest of the world, I was just a harmless, invisible old man, taking up space in the checkout line. A guy whose story was already written, just sitting in the waiting room until the clock ran out. I didn't admit this to anyone. I certainly didn't admit it to myself. I told my kids on our brief, bi-weekly phone calls that I was enjoying the rest. I told myself I had earned the right to do nothing. But underneath that calm, aggressively logical exterior, I was starving. I deeply missed the weight of responsibility. I missed walking into a room and feeling respected for my intellect and capability. Without a problem to solve or a family to provide for, I felt stripped of my identity. I possessed a desperate, unacknowledged craving to feel vital, useful, and admired one last time. I didn't know it then, but that is the most dangerous state of mind a man with a full bank account and an empty calendar can possibly be in. I thought my money and my intellect made me bulletproof. I didn't realize that my ego had already cracked the foundation. I needed to fix the problem. That's what engineers do. When a structure is failing, you don't just sit there and watch it crack. You reinforce it. You change the environment. My structural deficit was the house in Ohio, or rather the deafening physical silence inside it. By mid-January, the sky over Columbus turns into a permanent sheet of gray iron. I would sit by the bay window in my living room, watching the snow slowly bury the driveway, acutely aware that nobody was coming to visit. No kids, no grandkids, no colleagues. Just me, a ticking grandfather clock, and a thermostat I kept turning up just to feel some warmth. I was 70 years old, in perfect health, sitting on nearly $1 million in liquid assets, and I felt functionally dead. I refused to accept that. I decided I was going to engineer a solution. I called it a geographic cure. I would leave the winter behind and spend 6 months in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. When I told my son over the phone, he paused for a long time and asked if I was having a delayed midlife crisis. I laughed it off. To me, it wasn't a crisis. It was a carefully calculated project. I didn't just throw a dart at a map. I spent weeks analyzing exchange rates, cost of living indices, and neighborhood safety data. I went online and leased a luxury penthouse right on the Avenida Atlantica in Copacabana. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, white marble floors, and a balcony that looked straight out over the ocean. I mapped out a strict, heavily padded budget, exactly $6,000 a month. According to my projections, I could live like a diplomat in Brazil for half a year, eat at the finest restaurants, and soak up the sun without even making a dent in the principal of my retirement portfolio. I figured I might even engage in some casual, low-stakes dating. Nothing serious, just some companionship to pass the time. I was fully confident I was in total control of the environment. I wasn't some lonely, gullible retiree stepping off a cruise ship in a Hawaiian shirt. ready to be fleeced by the first person who smiled at me. I was Richard Vance. I managed massive infrastructure budgets. I spent my entire career seeing through contractor lies and mitigating risk. Nobody was going to pull one over on me. When the plane touched down at Galeon Airport and that thick, warm, tropical air hit my face, I felt a profound surge of something I hadn't felt in 3 years, of vitality, authority. I looked at the chaotic, vibrant city out the window of my cab and thought, I can navigate this. I am the architect of my own life again. It all felt so safe, so intensely logical. The math was flawless, but that's the fatal flaw in relying strictly on numbers. A spreadsheet can track your currency exchange down to the cent, but it cannot measure the exact depth of your own desperation. I thought I was booking a well-deserved victory lap. I didn't realize I was just a man trying to outrun his own obsolescence, carrying all his blind spots right there in his luggage. It happened on a Tuesday in early February. I was sitting at a high-end beach kiosk near Posto 5, watching the waves roll in. The waiter had brought me the bill, and there was an egregious overcharge, 3 extra caipirinhas I hadn't ordered. I'm an engineer. I don't pay for things that aren't on the spreadsheet. I was trying to explain the error, but my Portuguese was non-existent, and the waiter was getting visibly frustrated. I was raising my voice, feeling that hot, familiar prickle of embarrassment and helplessness. That's when she stepped in. "Excuse me," a voice said. "Let me help." I turned around. It was Camila. If you picture a scammer in Rio, you probably imagine a girl in a string bikini batting her eyelashes at a tourist. That wasn't her. She was 32, dressed in a tailored white linen suit, carrying a leather portfolio. She looked like she had just stepped out of a boardroom. In flawless, unaccented English, she calmly assessed the situation, turned to the waiter, and spoke quietly in Portuguese. Within 10 seconds, the bill was corrected, the waiter apologized, and the tension evaporated. I was incredibly grateful, but also deeply intrigued. I offered to buy her a drink as a thank you. She smiled, a polite but firm smile. "That's very kind of you, Richard, but I actually have a client meeting in 20 minutes. I'm just taking a quick break." She ordered a sparkling water and, this is the detail that anchored the hook, she insisted on paying for it herself. She told me she was an interior architect. We stood there for maybe 15 minutes, and she didn't ask me about my hotel or if I was vacationing alone. Instead, when I mentioned my background, her eyes lit up. She asked me a highly specific question about load-bearing distributions in high-rise foundations. She actually listened to my answer. For the first time in years, I wasn't an invisible old man. I was an expert. She gave me her card before she left. Just a clean, minimalist business card. No pressure. I waited 2 days before calling her. I told myself it was just networking. We didn't rush into anything. That was the genius of it. There were no late-night dinners or romantic walks on the beach at first. She invited me for afternoon coffees at these quiet, upscale bakeries tucked away in neighborhoods tourists never visit. She would bring blueprints from her supposed design projects, unrolling them on the table, and ask for my expert advice on structural feasibility. "The contractors here just want to do things the fast way," she would say, tapping a pencil against her chin. "I need someone who actually understands the math." Do you know how intoxicating that is? To a man who spent his life solving complex problems, suddenly having a beautiful, intelligent woman looking at you like you hold the answers to the universe. It was the exact drug I didn't know I was craving. She consistently paid for her half of our coffees and lunches during that first month. She actively steered me away from expensive tourist traps. She presented herself as entirely self-sufficient, a woman unimpressed by flashy displays of wealth, who valued my mind above all else. I felt a profound sense of validation. I remember looking in the mirror in my penthouse and thinking I had somehow beaten the system. I had bypassed the pathetic sugar daddy dynamic that traps so many older men. I had found a genuine partner of substance. I felt relevant. I felt alive. Of course, looking back, the hairline fractures were already forming in the foundation. Around week 6, she showed up to coffee looking exhausted. She confessed with clear reluctance that a few of her high-end clients were defaulting on their payments. It was just a temporary cash flow issue, she assured me, but it was threatening her firm's payroll. She didn't ask me for money. She just looked incredibly stressed, rubbing her temples, and I felt that old familiar urge to step in and fix the problem. Then came the weekend disappearances. Every other Friday, she would pack a small bag and tell me she had to drive to a remote inland town to visit her sick mother. "The cell service there is terrible," she'd say, kissing my cheek. "I probably won't be able to text you." I didn't question it. Why would I? She was an independent woman dealing with a family crisis. A pragmatic man respects boundaries. I noted the anomalies, sure, but I actively chose to file them away as acceptable variances. I was so blinded by the glow of my own reinstated ego that I completely ignored the smell of smoke. The first time I transferred money to her, I didn't just hand over cash like a fool. I engineered it. When her firm's cash flow issue reached a critical point, threatening her payroll, I sat down at my laptop and drafted a promissory note. $15,000. I literally typed out a repayment schedule with a nominal interest rate. In my master spreadsheet, I didn't log the transfer as a gift or an expense. I categorized it neatly as a short-term bridge loan. I convinced myself I was acting as an angel investor for a struggling entrepreneur. I wasn't some pathetic sugar daddy buying a young woman's affection. I was a seasoned executive providing strategic capital. That is the danger of being highly intelligent. You are incredibly skilled at building complex, logical frameworks to justify your own delusions. By month 4, she told me she was in a legal dispute with her landlord. I immediately offered the penthouse. It was only supposed to be for a few weeks until the dust settled, but her moving in changed the entire atmosphere of my life. Suddenly, my pristine, quiet apartment felt alive. I would come home from a walk and find her in the kitchen, cooking moqueca or roasting vegetables, wearing one of my oversized button-down shirts. The physical relationship between us was intense and deeply revitalizing. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing. I was a provider again. I was desired. I felt like a man in his prime. But her business kept pulling her away. She was stressed, constantly on the phone, weighed down by what she claimed was another $40,000 in outstanding vendor debts. I hated seeing her anxious. More than that, I hated that her work was cutting into our time together. So I made what I told myself was a lifestyle investment. I liquidated some mutual funds and paid off the $40,000. I didn't see it as paying her debts. I saw it as buying our freedom. I wanted her to be free to travel with me to Buenos Aires or the vineyards in Chile without checking her phone every 10 minutes. You see the mental gymnastics? A desperate man pays for company. An engineer simply optimizes his partner's schedule. The warning signs were glaring, flashing like a dashboard indicator, but I systematically disabled the alarms. I remember sitting at a pub in Ipanema one afternoon, waiting for Camilla to finish a meeting. I struck up a conversation with an American expat, a guy from Michigan nursing a draft beer. We got to talking, and I casually mentioned Camilla, her architecture firm, her temporary financial hiccups, the weekend trips she took to a remote inland town to care for her sick mother. The expat stopped drinking. He gave me a look of profound, agonizing pity. He leaned in and told me, word for word, that I was being bled. He laid out the classic local script: the fake boutique firm, the sudden business debts, the non-existent sick mother in a town with no cell service. I should have felt a cold sweat. I should have gone back to the penthouse and asked to see her corporate tax registry. Instead, I felt deeply insulted. I looked at this guy, overweight, wearing a stained t-shirt, clearly bitter about his own life, and I felt nothing but arrogant superiority. I told myself he was a cynical loser. Men like him had to pay by the hour for cheap affection. A man like me attracted a woman of substance. My ego simply would not allow me to consider the possibility that he and I were exactly the same kind of mark. Then came the calls from the States. I had asked my son to help authenticate a large wire transfer from my primary U.S. account to clear Camilla's vendor debts. He saw the numbers. He called me immediately, demanding to know where $55,000 had gone in 3 months. He didn't ask questions. He made accusations. He used the word scam. I hung up on him. I stopped answering his FaceTime calls. I stopped going to the expat bars. I retreated completely into the beautiful, insulated bubble Camilla and I had built in that penthouse. I convinced myself it was the two of us against a cynical, jealous world that couldn't possibly understand our connection. I was a man of the world. I had evaluated the risks. I had set my boundaries. I was in total control. I was so busy proving to everyone how smart I was that I completely locked the doors from the inside, trapping myself in a burning building just to stay warm. "14 months into the relationship, the isolation was complete, but I couldn't see it that way. I didn't see an empty room. I saw an empire of two. And that is exactly when she presented the blueprints for the final stage of the collapse. She didn't come to me asking for a handout. That would have triggered my defenses. Instead, she brought me a proposal. It was a Tuesday evening. She laid a meticulously crafted 40-page business plan on the kitchen island. It was for a boutique bed and breakfast in Buzios, a wealthy, stunning coastal town a few hours east of Rio. She didn't just pitch an idea. She gave me pro forma statements, projected occupancy rates, renovation budgets, and a comprehensive risk analysis. I didn't just read it, I scrutinized it. I put on my reading glasses, pulled out my calculator, and ran my own models. It was brilliant. The math was incredibly sound. But it wasn't the math that sold me. It was the psychological hook. Buying this property gave me exactly what I was starving for: a project, a complex, tangible structure to manage, a reason to wake up at 6 a.m. with fire in my chest. The asking price was $300,000. For me, that meant liquidating a massive chunk of my core retirement portfolio. But I was willing to do it. There was just one logistical hurdle. I was an American on a tourist visa. I didn't have permanent residency in Brazil. Camilla sat across from me, nursing a glass of wine, looking genuinely troubled. She patiently explained the local foreign investment tax laws. If my name went on the property deed, we would instantly lose an exorbitant percentage to international taxes and bureaucratic red tape. "It's going to destroy our profit margins, Richard," she said, looking me right in the eyes. "Our margins." The solution she proposed was smooth, obvious, and practically textbook in its business logic. We register the LLC, and the property deed entirely in her name. Did a tiny, rational voice in the back of my mind scream at me? Yes. For a fraction of a second, the engineer in me saw the catastrophic structural flaw, but I crushed it under the immense blinding weight of my own ego. I convinced myself that this wasn't a risk, it was the ultimate leverage. Buying this business tied her to me permanently. It intertwined us financially and professionally. I wasn't giving away my life savings. I was securing her presence for the rest of my life. I was engineering my legacy. The next morning, I logged into my U.S. brokerage account. I sold off blue-chip stocks I had held for over 2 decades. I authorized the international wire transfer. $300,000 launched across the equator, directly into the ether. I had crossed the point of no return, but the cruelest part of this entire ordeal is that the scam didn't end with the wire transfer. If she had simply vanished the next day, it would have been a quick, merciful execution, but she was an absolute master of her craft. She knew she had to give me the illusion of total victory to keep me compliant while the money cleared and dispersed. She gave me my false validation. 3 days after the transfer, she drove us up to Buzios to tour our new property. We walked through the courtyard of this beautiful, slightly weathered colonial estate. She had hired a local architect to meet us there. I will never forget the feeling of standing in the midday tropical sun, unrolling massive physical blueprints on a dusty mahogany table. I was pointing out load-bearing walls, dictating structural changes to the floor plan, tapping my pen against the paper. The architect was nodding respectfully, furiously taking notes. Camilla walked up behind me, wrapped her arms around my waist, and leaned her head against my shoulder. She looked at the contractor and said, in perfect English, so I would be absolutely sure to hear it, "Listen to my husband. He is our savior on this project. He knows exactly what he's doing." Husband and savior. A few days later, she handed me a thick, heavy folder. Inside were the state registry documents, the LLC formation, stamped, signed, and notarized. I didn't know they were flawless forgeries. I just saw the official government seals and my own brilliant business strategy coming to life. We spent the rest of that week in a luxury hotel overlooking the ocean, drinking vintage champagne, celebrating our new empire. I was a respected developer in a foreign country. I had a stunning, devoted partner. I had completely reinvented my existence. I had never felt more powerful, more relevant, or more secure. I was standing at the absolute glittering summit of my own delusion, completely unaware that the ground had already vanished, and there was nothing but dead air beneath my feet. At the 18-month mark, I finally agreed to return to Ohio. It was just for 2 weeks, strictly to attend my grandson's high school graduation. I didn't want to go. I felt an irrational anxiety about leaving our empire unattended, but Camilla insisted. She packed my suitcase, kissed me at the airport terminal, and told me to take lots of pictures. She said she would be spending the next 2 weeks finalizing the contractor bids for the Buzios property. 3 days into the trip, I sent her a WhatsApp message. It stayed on a single gray check mark. By that evening, I tried calling. The automated voice told me the number was no longer in service. At first, my brain did what it had been trained to do. It generated logical contingencies. She dropped her phone in the ocean. She was visiting her mother in that inland town with the dead zones. She had lost her device and hadn't gotten a new SIM card yet. But a cold, heavy dread had already started pooling in my stomach. It wasn't panic. It was the quiet, absolute terror of an engineer watching a bridge sway just a fraction of an inch too far in the wind. I didn't call the police. I opened my laptop and hired a real estate lawyer in Rio de Janeiro to pull the municipal records for the Buzios property. I paid him $300 by credit card. 24 hours later, he sent me a brief, heavily factual email. He had checked the cartorio. The colonial estate in Buzios had never been sold. The LLC that Camilla had registered did legally exist, but it was an empty shell, registered to a post office box in a favela. The moment my $300,000 cleared the corporate account, it had been dispersed into half a dozen untraceable offshore accounts. I didn't stay for the graduation. I changed my flight and rushed back to Gay Leon, sitting in the dark cabin for 10 hours, completely numb. When I unlocked the door to the Copacabana penthouse, there was an echo. That was the first thing I noticed, the thick silence. The apartment had been surgically stripped bare. Every trace of her was gone. Her clothes, her cosmetics, her laptop. My 2 vintage Omega watches were missing from the bedroom drawer. Even the heavy leather folder containing the blueprints and the forged state registry documents had vanished. I stood in the center of the white marble living room, gripping the handle of my suitcase, completely frozen. I went down to the lobby and found the doorman, a guy named Marcos, who had always greeted us with a smile. I asked him in broken Portuguese when Camilla had left. He looked at me with genuine mild confusion. "She moved out on Thursday, Mr. Richard," he said, 2 days after my flight to Ohio. Then he offered the detail that finally severed the last cable. The young man with the rental truck helped her with the boxes, her namorado, her boyfriend. I just nodded. I turned around, walked to the elevator and pressed the button. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I went back up to the empty penthouse, sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the wall for hours as the sun went down over the Atlantic. $400,000. That was the final tally. The wire transfer, the rent, the bridge loans, the lifestyle funding. Gone. But sitting in the dark that night, I realized the money wasn't what was suffocating me. It was the catastrophic, total collapse of my own ego. I hadn't been an angel investor. I hadn't been a savior or a brilliant developer or a man living a revitalized second youth. I was an easy, desperate mark. I was a cliché, a lonely old man who bought the illusion of relevance at the absolute highest market price. I had evaluated the risk, run the numbers, and willingly built the scaffolding for my own execution. I am back in Ohio now. I had to break the lease on the penthouse and fly home in disgrace. I live in a cramped, cheap apartment on the outskirts of Columbus. My liquid portfolio is effectively zero. I survive strictly on my Social Security checks and the small monthly pension from my old firm. My son hasn't spoken to me in 8 months. I can't say I blame him. I chose my own arrogant delusion over the warnings of the only family I had left. I alienated the people who actually loved me to protect a woman who viewed me as nothing more than a highly lucrative assignment. I still have a spreadsheet. I check it every Sunday morning, tracking the price of groceries, mapping out my utility bills, ensuring I don't overdraw my checking account. I'm still the guy who manages the math. I don't hate Camilla. She simply identified a structural vulnerability and applied the exact amount of pressure needed to bring the whole thing down. The hardest thing to accept isn't the poverty, it's the clarity. I look back at the cafe in Copacabana, the forged blueprints, the weekend disappearances, and I see the exact moments I actively chose to look away. Because the truth is, if you think your intellect makes you immune to your own loneliness, you are already in free fall. You just haven't hit the ground yet.